given the time, I will go straight on to the rest of the discussion about the GDC and invite our next speaker, Ms. Sorina Teleanu, who is the Director of Knowledge at the Diplo Foundation, to give us a little more detail about the GDC and its current state. So, Sorina, over to you, please.
Thank you, Nigel. Hello, everyone. Not an easy task to follow Renata with, trying to unpack the GDC, which is not something we have written, but let me give it a try. I do have a few slides, so I'm going to try to share those. And I also hope I'll finish quickly so we have a bit of discussion of concerns and priorities and whatever you might want to share from the region. Let me see the magic of sharing. Right, so Renata already mentioned WSIS, which is the World Summit for the Information Society, and I felt it's good to start a bit with the background. So we are sure we are all on the same page. I think I'm still hearing you from there, Nigel. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Thanks. Right. So a bit of a background. We have been talking a bit about the World Summit on the Information Society, and Renata mentioned that there is this WSIS forum happening in Geneva this week. And I just wanted to highlight once again that this whole discussion about the Global Digital Compact is not happening in a vacuum. There have been things happening for quite a while, and that goes back to the World Summit on the Information Society, which was in 2003, 2005. When the world basically came together and started thinking about what we can do to build this more inclusive information society, which was the terminology used back then. So it's been quite some years since we were discussing about this broader inclusiveness, bridging the digital divide, making technologies a bit more accessible. How much have we achieved of that? I guess it's a question for everyone to still look at, and that's why we're still discussing WSIS implementation these days, including here in Geneva. Renata mentioned we have a few documents adopted back then, a declaration of principle, plan of action, commitment, and an agenda, with quite a few detailed so-called action lines for things that countries and other stakeholders wanted to achieve as soon as possible. And what you see on the screen are actually all of them action lines, and you see what the focus was around. A lot on access, a lot on capacity building, cooperation, and a bunch of other things that are still relevant today. So we had WSIS back in 2003, 2005, and out of WSIS, a bunch of processes, a bunch of implementation mechanisms have been launched to look at what can be done and what should be done and what is actually being done to implement those action lines. And again, have a more inclusive information society, more secure use of technologies, and everything related to that. Yes, we were talking about slightly different things 20 years ago when it comes to technology. AI was not something on everyone's mind. Google was just being, launched a few years back in 1998. So maybe not the same amount of challenges and not the same depth of challenges, but many of the issues we were dealing with back then are still pretty much relevant today as we're discussing new processes and new mechanisms. We had the IGF as an outcome of this, and I'm not going to mention that because, well, we are at an IGF right now, which means you're all familiar with what this means. We had the UN Group on the Information Society, which is supposed to help coordinate activities across UN agencies when it comes to implementation of WSIS action lines, and again, driving a bit more of an inclusive. I still use Information Society because this was the terminology back then, but we can also easily change it to digital society or whatever other terms we're using these days. And as we're looking forward next year, there will be the WSIS Plus 20 high-level event at the General Assembly, which will be looking back at these 20 years and the extent to which we have implemented or not the WSIS action lines and the ambitious goals that were set back then as well. So this year we do have discussions about the Global Digital Compact, about strengthening digital cooperation, but then there's also a discussion about how we're linking this with what's going to happen next year in the context of the review of WSIS action lines and their implementation, and also the upcoming deadline for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which unfortunately, I think we all agree we haven't done very well at achieving. So again, just a bit of a background of how we have actually gotten here. Renata also mentioned that there have been quite a few documents issued by the Secretary General. We had the agenda for digital cooperation the high-level panel on digital cooperation. So everything is in some way connected to everything. The question from here on is how we're actually building on these connections as we look more carefully into implementation. So we're also asking a bit what changed again between 2003, 2005, and right now when we're discussing the GDC and the review of WSIS action lines. And we have heard a few things about artificial intelligence being something pretty new, content governance, which is not something we were discussing in 2003. And that's true. These are issues that we were not discussing back then. But also if we go through the action lines and objectives of the WSIS documents, many of the elements there, for instance, around ethics, around safety and security, still pretty much apply to these areas, even if back then we were not necessarily talking about them in these terms. So what I'm trying to say is that we should also look a bit at connecting things from back then with whatever we're discussing right now. And this is there are a lot of discussions this week, for instance, in Geneva about this. For a bit of fun, we did this exercise at Diplo where we took all the documents from 2003, 2005, the WSIS outcome documents, and simply replaced information society with digital society, ICT with digital technology, just to see if, okay, if we only change the terminology, how much of this document is still relevant. And I guess it's not going to be a surprise for anyone that if you just read it with slightly different terminology, it all still applies, and we all still need to do a little more to implement what we agreed back then while we look forward at new goals and objectives. Finally, going into the Global Digital Compact, I have quite a few detailed slides, so I'm not going to spend too much time into that. I'll share this with everyone so you can go and read them afterwards, in the quietness of your own space. But I do want to highlight a few things because what I also wanted to do was to look at the contribution that I think CTU coordinated, I think in April last year from the Caribbean IGF and also from the SIDS IGF, and provided this input when the Office of the Tech Envoy ran the public consultation on things to be included in the GDC. So what I did was to try to look a bit at the priorities outlined in that document and how those might or might not be reflected in the GDC. What you see on the next screen is the most recent version of the Global Digital Compact, which is the so-called Rev 1, Revision 1, which is built on the previous version, which was the Zero Draft. So you will also see some highlights with the changes. A few overarching reflections, also repeating a bit what Renata has been saying. There are a lot of commitments in the GDC, some with timelines, like we want to do this by 2030, for instance, others without timelines. There is a very strong anchoring of the commitments into SDGs, which is a good thing because, again, we're trying to connect things a bit better and seeing how we can actually leverage the digital technologies for achieving sustainable development. There are some very detailed specific goals, but not all over the place. And I guess that's something also that governments can continue working on as the negotiations advance. And what I like the most, I think, is this recognition of the need for digital governance solutions to actually reflect the different needs and realities across the world. So it's not, the UN from New York saying this is what the whole of the world should be doing, but rather seeing how these objectives and goals could be adapted to the realities of the communities, the countries actually implementing them. And as Renata again already mentioned, there are a few proposals for new mechanisms, in particular around artificial intelligence. These are the principles that were mentioned before. What you see with strike changes and red underlined are the differences from the previous version. Not going to spend time here. The multi-stakeholder principle that was mentioned before is here as well, forward-looking, innovation-friendly, and all the things we really would like to see driving digital cooperation as we go forward. And these are the objectives and commitments around each of the objectives. So closing the digital divide that Renata spent a bit of time explaining with connectivity, skills, digital public goods and digital public infrastructure, expanding the inclusion and benefits from the digital economy. Then this very broad chapter, which is including human rights, internal governance, trust and safety, and then information integrity around misinformation, disinformation, and whatnot. With this very long title of fostering an inclusive, open, safe, secure digital space that respects, promotes, and protects human rights. Fourth, around advancing international data governance. And finally, the fifth objective and set of commitments is around the governance of emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence. Again, those are the changes from the previous version, if anyone is curious to see what changed over the past few months. So I'm not going to spend time on this either because Renata has done an excellent job covering it. We're talking about closing all digital divides, accelerating process across SDGs, doing connectivity and all of this. Just a few pointers on things that have changed and on things that might be worthwhile paying attention to as the negotiations continue. So the recognition of innovative solutions that can help deliver better connectivity, a very interesting addition to the new version. Whatever we mean by these innovative solutions, quite a lot of references to environmental sustainability, which is also something that was included in the contribution from that the CTU coordinated last year. The inclusion of marginalized communities and persons with from vulnerable, again, communities in the development and implementation of digital connectivity strategy, and a bunch of other things, again, related to connectivity. And this is what you, the community, were saying a little over a year ago about what you think the needs would be important to be reflected in the GDC. I think some of them are pretty well reflected in this, including the zero draft, but also in the Rev 1. Including around data collection funds, maybe not specifically around IXPs, which is a very specific issue, or around universal service funds, but there are quite a few other references there. This need for consideration and public awareness of the environmental risk posed by digital technologies is also reflected in the Global Digital Compact, but maybe not necessarily with the strong emphasis you might be having from the small island developing states with the more immediate threats you're facing there. Digital literacy skills and capacity a lot around building the skills of individuals to interact with technologies, also use the technologies for the achievement of whatever goals they have, economic, social interactions with others and whatnot. Development of digital competencies of public officials, where we also have a bit of a question whether we want to only develop the competencies of public officials when it comes to the development of digital public services, or whether there is a bit more we want to train them on. But these are issues of nuances. And then quite a lot to focus on promoting decent work, creating this kind of safety nets for whatever might come as we implement more automation or the integration of AI into the world of work. And going back to the contributions from last year, there was a bit of focus on capacity building, enhancing digital skills, raising awareness. So there are a few connections there. Digital public goods and digital public infrastructures, I'll skip them because they were covered earlier. There were also quite a few references to these issues, including around open source, when you made a contribution last year with the highlight that Renata also mentioned, that it's not a bulletproof solution. We are not looking at open source as the solution to everything. There still needs to be safety issues there considered. Second objective and set of commitments around expanding inclusions and benefits from the digital economy for all. It's mostly around inclusion in the sense of, as you see on the first bullet point, open, fair, inclusive, non-discriminatory digital environment for all. Maybe not so much on the digital economy in the sense of what you, for instance, were saying last year, for example, around reducing barriers to digital trade and fostering a bit more this seamless, maybe, e-commerce, digital commerce across border, but otherwise quite a lot around, for instance, encouraging cooperation to accelerate access to research capacity, to support digital entrepreneurship, and a bunch of other things that might support, at the end of the day, this broader digital economy. Moving on to this broad chapter around human rights, internet governance, digital trust and safety, and information integrity. Human rights is also something you did highlight in your contribution. And what I like a lot going through the contribution an hour ago was this very first bullet point you're seeing on the screen. Policy requirements, whatever those might be, should not be modeled solely on existing, in this case it was European models, but I would say on existing Western models, and again highlighting the need for whatever is being proposed as a solution to reflect the realities and the needs of various communities around the world. And again, I do like that a lot of the provisions in the Global Digital Compact, this current draft, do highlight this. Internet governance, this is a bit of interesting chapter in the Global Digital Compact. It goes back to the discussion quite many years ago about what do we actually mean by internet governance, and now we have been having an interesting conversation about the extent to which internet governance and digital governance are completely different terms, whether we can separate them from each other or not. But anyway, one of the main goals here is to promote this open, global, interoperable, and reliable internet, which is a bit of the terminology that we have been hearing and promoting for quite a while in the internet governance or digital governance space, depending on what term you want to use. A few provisions about the IGF, and then this introduction of avoiding the risk of internet fragmentation. Which is good to include. Probably it would deserve a bit more of a clarity as to what do we mean by internet fragmentation at the technical level, at the policy level, and all these clarifications. And going back to what was in the contributions from last year, I also like this and call for collaboration on a regional level on decisions, whatever decisions are being made when it comes to regulating the digital space, and then looking at how language might be a barrier or not to this broader inclusion into digital governance. On trust and safety, there are quite a few calls on private companies, which I think do deserve a bit of attention. So if you go and read the document, pay attention to these things. Some of them are pretty interesting. For instance, this call on social media platforms to establish safe and secure reporting mechanisms for users to report potential violations. I think the question we could be having here is to what extent calls are actually going to drive a change. But if we discuss about multi-stakeholderism, and there is also buy-in from the other actors into the whole Global Digital Compact, I guess this has a little more chances of actually also becoming some sort of a reality. Information integrity, this is indeed one of the major challenges of the digital space that we're facing today. And unfortunately, we do not really have a very easy solution, or actually no solution whatsoever right now. How do we deal with this very fast and widespread of misinformation and disinformation? And it's very good that the Global Digital Compact is trying to tackle it through different set of commitments related to more training, developing of capacities at the individual level to be able to critically interact with online content, and also the promotion of what is called here science-based information, a very interesting term, and this promotion of reliable and accurate information. And again, quite a few calls on social media platforms, which are in some way the intermediaries in all of these discussions. Here as well, you were talking about the need for regional cooperation between both public and private actors, and I would expand that to also international cooperation, which is really key if we really want to try to even get near addressing this issue of misleading content. Data governance has its three different sections, one on data privacy and security, skipping it quickly, another one on data exchanges and standards that Renata covered quite in detail earlier, and the last one on data for development. And here probably the most interesting element that might come to life if the GDC is approved as it looks now is this potential work at the UNGA level towards a framework for international data governance. I've been having quite a few discussions with many of the small countries here in Geneva, and I don't feel that everyone is equally ready to contribute to these international debates on international data governance, but it will definitely be something interesting to keep an eye on, and not only to keep an eye on, but also make sure there are contributions from a wide range of countries with different levels of development and readiness to contribute to this kind of debates. Finally, enhancing international governance of emerging technologies, including AI. Renata also covered this quite well, so I'll skip it. We have this idea of a scientific panel on AI and emerging technology to help a bit with building this so-called scientific consensus of what are the risks around AI and emerging technologies that we might want to tackle through whatever governance mechanisms. And then probably more important, the idea of a global fund for AI and emerging technologies to support, including with capacity building and the development of localized data sets, localized AI models, and whatnot. We'll see how that goes. I guess it's a matter of seeing to what extent the Secretary General, if this is created, manages to attract the necessary support from relevant actors who are in a position to contribute funds to this global initiative. And last but not least, we have this follow-up and review mechanism that I'll skip because it doesn't look extremely easy to unpack right now. But as I'm sharing the slide, I do encourage you to take a look. There's a lot of roles and responsibilities on various UN agencies, on the Secretary General. Then there is this two-year, post-two-year high-level review at the UN General Assembly level. And then some work to be done also within the context of existing mechanisms, including the WSIS Forum and the IGF. So these are also things that are still being discussed. I think, again, the key message would be to look into how to connect all these things together and make sure that the objectives we had in 2003, 2005, and also along the way are also still reflected in what we're trying to achieve moving forward, and also connecting with the agenda for sustainable development. I think I was longer than I planned, but I'll stop sharing my screen here and hoping we can still have a bit of time for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sorina. You're a star. I think you very, very quickly and most effectively went through the GDC points, and a particular feature which I'll have to say I didn't expect, but very, very much appreciated, was your reference to the CTU coordinated inputs and giving information in terms of what aspects of it you saw being incorporated into the GDC so far. So that certainly has helped us a lot in terms of picking it up going forward. Dr. Dwan, before you mentioned about the regular multi-stakeholder updates and the possibility of working through your governments and so on to get further inputs into the whole process. Is there any other suggestion you might have related to?
Speak to governments. I think that's the main avenue right now, because it is at the point where it is an intergovernmental process and governments are negotiating. Actually, at the end of next week in New York, it's the first set of concrete negotiations. So if you really want to make sure your input passes through this process, speak with your government's representative who are then going to represent your country position in New York. I think that's the best avenue right now to make sure you try to have some sort of an input into the process.
I was saying, Sorina, that we very much appreciated your commentary on what aspects of the CTU coordinated contributions have been included into the GDC so far, and I was asking about possibilities of, in addition to what Dr. Dwan had mentioned before you, what possibilities there might still be apart from following the multi-stakeholder updates and working through your governments. If there's any other suggestion you might have for people to be able to make any input to the GDC development, even at this stage.
Again, repeating what I was just saying while you were disconnected, I think it's still through governments, since we are now at the level where it is an intergovernmental process and we have negotiations starting at the end of next week in New York. I think the best chance to actually have something reflected in these negotiations is to speak with governments and make your point as strong as possible. We're still having discussions here in Geneva in the context of the WSIS Forum, and then there will be an IGF, but really the process is intergovernmental. So I would strongly encourage everyone to speak with governments and put forward your input there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I see Tracy Hackshaw. Maybe we go to Tracy.
Thanks, Nigel. Hi, Sorina. So I have I guess the jackpot question. The IGF and the future of the IGF, meaning the United Nations Global IGF, given what the GDC is saying on the concept. So I know there's quite a lot of debate around this in terms of what the IGF is currently doing and what it might evolve to. And then the GDC is saying, well, the IGF, yes, we support the IGF, but how about these other mechanisms that we would run out of, let's say, the New York process and so on. Any thoughts on how that is evolving given the commentary and the negotiations that are happening?
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, it is a bit of the elephant in the room, and it has been so for quite many years, not only in the context of the GDC, but again, going back to 2003, 2005, when we had the WSIS outcomes from which the IGF is actually emanating. If you have looked at the Tunis agenda, the paragraph outlining the mandate of the IGF is quite long, but for some reason, we seem to be focusing on only letter one of 10 letters in the mandate of the IGF, which is facilitate public discourse on matters related to public policy issues on internet governance. If we go a little down the line, for instance, there is this very interesting references about the ability of the IGF to look at emerging issues as they come up, which is everything we're discussing these days, and issue recommendation when appropriate, which I feel we need to talk a bit more about also in the context of implementation of the Global Digital Compact. I think some of these discussions are accelerating a bit because, as you have also mentioned, some people are not particularly comfortable with the idea of just leaving the IGF deal with whatever we mean by internet governance, whereas everything else might be dealt with somewhere else. And I think this has also been reflected in the new version of the Global Digital Compact, where the references to the IGF have been changed a bit. And there is also this invitation for the IGF to come up with this particular track in which it will bring together people to discuss implementation of the GDC. I think there is still a wish for that part about the role of the IGF in implementation to be a bit stronger. And that's also a moment when governments who are advocating for the IGF can go and put forward, again, their wishes a bit more strongly maybe than before. I guess we don't necessarily, or we shouldn't have necessarily waited or go with this idea that a decision on what the IGF should be doing should only be made next year in the context of WSIS plus 20. But unfortunately, this is where we are. And this is also one of the arguments that have been used by the co-facilitators when making reference to their referencing of the IGF, saying, well, we don't want to say too much about the IGF because it is up to WSIS review process next year to actually decide on it, which might be a bit forced. But bottom line, good news is that things have changed slightly between the previous version and the current one. And there is still room for improvements according to some views. So let's see what comes next. If you have a chance to talk to your government and push for something, please go ahead.
And a direct follow-up on that, the concept of internet governance versus, so there's digital governance, AI governance, and so on. What are your thoughts on that, having seen what the GDC is trying to say? Because so they seem to be compartmentalizing the IGF for certain things, but here's some other areas we need to deal with, other governance areas we need to deal with that we will in fact look at. I don't want to say separately, but certainly complementarily. Maybe that's the right way to phrase it. So the thinking that I'm sure some people have is why have all of these structures and discussions and things to fly off in the world to be at 10 meetings a year discussing pieces of the puzzle. Why not put it in one bucket and let's let's have it out in this larger forum or summit or whatever you want to call it. Any thoughts on that and how the GDC negotiations are going to deal with that larger issue about what do we call the IGF and this concept of governance and internet governance, etc.
Again, you're raising a very important and interesting point because we seem to use language very lightly these days. Unfortunately, we talk about data governance, we talk about content governance, we talk about AI governance, digital governance, internet governance, but then we don't really sit and take a step back and ask, okay, what are the differences between all these things? Who is dealing with what? Can we, as you say, can we all just try to bring them all together and have a bit of more cohesion, consistency, whatever words we want to use? One example I like to give whenever we talk, for instance, about the distinction between internet governance and digital governance and whether the IGF is discussing only one or the other is, okay, look at the agenda of the most recent Internet Governance Forum meeting and try to make a distinction. What is internet governance and what is digital governance? Can you make that very clear distinction? And then if you say, okay, we want the IGF to only deal with internet governance, but we want everyone else to do digital governance, at what point do you say, okay, we stop here because it's only internet governance and then everything else is digital? I mean, also in this world today, everything kind of goes over the classical TCP/IP protocol. So can we really differentiate all these things? I think we do, all of us discussing these things, we do need to try to take a step back and try to have more clarity in our discussions and then going ahead and saying, okay, we should be discussing these issues here and addressing those issues there. Yeah, we do. I strongly think we do need a bit more clarity in our own conversation and making sure we are talking about the same things before we actually make decisions about these things, which apparently is not so easy, but fingers crossed we'll get there.
And I guess the final question, I see no other hands, I'll take the liberty of asking.
Actually, I think there was one more hand. I mean,
I'll just wrap up my volley with So I'm impressed with how you added or maybe overlaid the CIGF and SIDS IGF response in the initial consultations to the GDC on top of the of your analysis. So having reviewed that and understanding where the SIDS are, as a limited resource, limited resource countries, many things that we have to deal with, limited people to deal with the things that we need to deal with, etc., etc. Is there a way for the SIDS to really work together to have their voices truly heard in something like this? Again, I know you speak to diplomats, having followed you on what you're doing in Diplo with trying to build capacity within a diplomatic frontiers and these issues. So using that same thinking, do you see a role for the SIDS, in a similar kind of way that we could get together, find our voices and, really have, the 50 plus countries in this environment? Is there a way you think we can find our voices to be heard in this discussion and heard, not just heard, but listened to? Maybe that's the right way to phrase it. Thanks.
Yeah, as you're saying, not just heard, but also listen to and have a meaningful contribution to this process. That's what we're saying, not only to small island developing states, but basically to the whole of the global south. These are so many things happening at the same time. It's kind of impossible for one single country to follow everything and also to have a meaningful contribution into all of this. So we are encouraging in it as much as possible countries with the same interest or with some sort of similar characteristic to try to join forces and come up with joint contributions, speak with one single voice in these discussions, like the EU is doing. We keep talking about, how amazing the European Union is with the regulatory framework and whatnot. Yeah, because they do speak with one voice. You have the European Commission, they're representing everyone, and that's it. I'm not saying it's easy to replicate all of that, But if there is one thing indeed that smaller countries and developing countries can and should be doing is to try to speak a bit more with one voice as much as possible. I know there are differences between, countries, government priorities, capacities and whatnot, but I'm pretty sure there are issues on which you do have the same goals and the same objectives. So even on only those, you do speak with the same voice and you ensure this strong presence. Okay, this time it's this country. Next time the other country will go and speak for us. This sort of coordination will help. And I'm seeing this happening here in Geneva with the African Union. So I'm not using only the EU as an example. They have created this African Union coordination group on digital issues. So they are trying to keep a more active eye, if I can say that, on digital discussions in Geneva with this kind of rotation. So you go to the ITU and you follow this, you go to the WTO and you follow this. And then we meet every now and then and exchange opinions and see how we can have a stronger voice. So this kind of learning maybe from others and seeing how you can have this more coordinated approach, I think is the way to go. I hope that helps a bit.
Let me jump in at that point. I did see one more hand, Dr. Arlene Lang. Are you still wanting to take the floor?
I just didn't want to take up more time because we still have so much more to go.
Go ahead.
What has been learned from the development of the WMO's unified data policy? Because my enterprise, the Weather and Climate Enterprise, is pretty much built on ICT. And so some of the discussion that was just asked about how do you have voices of the smaller countries be heard? In the development of that data policy, we did have discussions about what this unified data policy meant for low resource countries. But perhaps because the atmosphere knows no boundary, it was a lot easier to deal with that.
Unfortunately, I'm not very familiar with this particular instrument, but I think you are raising a very important point. Are we looking at examples and lessons learned from other processes around data governance before we're trying to come up with something new? And what kind of lessons have we learned about exactly the capacity of all of the actors to contribute? And I'll also refer back to what I was saying earlier. In our discussions here with people in Geneva, we are getting messages from quite a few countries saying, yes, there is this call for a strong international data governance mechanism, but we feel we're not ready for this discussion because we do not have the capacities to, even know what we want with our own data governance at a national level. So then if we end up at an international negotiation table, it will be mostly others imposing their views on us, which is not necessarily what we might want from an international data framework, which is inclusive and whatnot. So I very much like your question, and I'll try to raise it here in Geneva as much as possible. What kind of lessons have we learned from more specific instruments on data governance, especially when it comes to involvement of everyone, basically? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I put something in the chat with a link to the WMO bulletin on the unified data policy, if that might help.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lang. And let me say a very, very warm and appreciative thank you to Sorina as well for this presentation and discussion.